So, at the time of recording, I have been laid off with over 2,000 other people from my former company. And as I trekked through the quagmire known as online job boards, I found myself playing Disney movies from my DVD collection in the background. My boyfriend only encouraged this habit when he came up to visit for a weekend as an early birthday present to me, which made for a really sweet and cozy time. Now, while films of the Renaissance era and Moana are my primary form of Disney comfort food, I started watching Snow White quite a bit, which I'm pretty sure has garnered reactions along the lines of either, "Oh cool, the OG classic," or "Oh god, how can you watch that? It's so boring." So why Disney's Snow White? Well, in truth, before I let my channel fall into suspended animation due to life events, I already had a fairly developed script discussing this film in the works. Now, while I don't have a fancy degree in film studies or criticism, I do have a bachelor's in animation and graduated from Animation Mentor afterwards, or as I call it, my pseudo-masters. And with all the spicy takes, drama, and whatever surrounding Rachel Zegler in the live-action version of the film that no one wants, I figured I might as well spruce up the script and toss my hat into the ring. Instead of just lambasting the live-action remake, Disney, or Rachel Zegler though, I'd rather have a more constructive discussion about the original film. Specifically, the sheer amount of effort and risks involved to make Snow White work and the enormous technical leaps it made for the medium of animation. Even though Hollywood wants to trick everyone into thinking animation is a genre with the best animated picture category, it is in fact an artistic medium and I will die on that hill. I also want to take some time to give the titular princess a little more credit than I personally think she is due at this point. So outside of the solace that these films guarantee work for VFX artists and such, I do deeply loathe these soulless remakes.
Why is that not a surprise?
I'm sorry?
Now, while I really have no qualms about Rachel Zegler playing Snow White as a Latina woman, her disparaging comments have really irked me since last year. Particularly this comment she made to Vanity Fair in October of 2022. "It's an 85-year-old cartoon, and our version is a refreshing story about a young woman who has a function beyond 'someday my prince will come.'" Did she even watch the original movie? Because this definitely isn't the own she or Disney thinks this is.
I was scared of the original cartoon. I think I watched it once and then I never picked it up again.
Though if I'm being honest, the way she says this reads more like she's parroting what the Disney company wants her to say. I also don't think actors necessarily need to enjoy the source material of a remake they're participating in since they don't control much of the creative vision anyway. Her comments about being scared of the movie as a kid though are kind of endearing since it's similar to the shared experience of other kids who are scared of the Wicked Witch of the West or E.T. like myself. Really, all of this reeks of how the executives of the Disney company have an apparent disdain for the very movies that allowed them to become the multimedia hydra they are today. The company seems all too happy to spit on Walt's grave and influence if it means it'll raise their bottom line. It also highlights a complete failure to recognize how impactful the film Snow White was, not just for their multimedia empire, but for the entire animation industry as a whole. Though to be absolutely clear, Snow White wasn't the first animated feature film. That honor belongs to El Apostol, which released in 1917, a whole 20 years earlier. While Snow White wasn't the first, it's easily the more impactful of the two given how it smashed the door open and demanded that animation be taken seriously. Because before this film, animation was relegated to shorts like the Silly Symphonies and no one had faith in an audience watching an entire animated feature. The production of Snow White was even called Disney's Folly and his own wife said no one would pay a dime to see animated dwarfs or 80 minutes. As a fellow creative, I feel Walt's pain in dealing with that kind of disbelief. Needless to say, Walt was taking a massive risk when making what would become one of the most influential films in all of cinematic history. Costs for production were initially earmarked by Roy and Walt Disney to be around $250,000 to $500,000 US, which was already 10 times the amount needed to create one of their Disney shorts. As these costs continued to soar, Walt even put up his own house as collateral. Eventually though, he had to show the half-finished movie to the vice president of the Bank of America in order to secure a loan for $250,000. Walt really didn't want to do this but knew he had no other choice. Thankfully he managed to secure the loan with what was shown. The final production budget for the film in 1937 was $1.49 million, which when adjusted for inflation would be about $31.7 million in 2023. Snow White also had a massive production team with 750 artists, 32 animators, 25 background artists, and 102 assistants all working upon thousands of drawings. If you've ever wondered how many drawings it took to make an 80-minute feature film, The Illusion of Life actually has a page on this. Here's a page it's on from my own copy of this huge book, complete with art from a Walt-era film taking up another entire page. I actually really adore this book since it also has a little flip book on the corners and even shows pencil tests running across some of the pages. Like, come on, look at this. You can't tell me this isn't cool. Anyways, do note that even today, most animated films play at 24 frames per second, which according to this page in The Illusion of Life means that 460,800 drawings are used in the final film. And those are just the drawings. Once they're put onto cells and were painted by the ink and paint ladies of Disney, that number is immediately doubled. During this time, animation was considered a man's medium, so women across many studios could only get jobs in the ink and paint departments as a result. Even then, these women really are the unsung heroes of animation. The women leading this production team on Snow White even got chemistry degrees in order to better work with the paint to emulate rouge on Snow White's cheeks. Yet Walt had the audacity to question if the ladies were capable of doing such a thing skillfully despite putting on such makeup every day. I swear to God. Moving on, the story sketchmen, which is another name for pre-visualization, aka the guys who plan scenes and sequences before filming, would easily do 75,000 drawings. Layout artists, who are responsible for defining the perspective and the depth of backgrounds, would contribute about 22,000 drawings to the final picture. The animators would contribute about 576,000 drawings, which were usually timed on 4s, meaning that they would draw a major pose every 4 frames for an animated shot. In-betweeners would then contribute around 1,036,800 drawings to fill in the gaps of the animators' poses. Then the cleanup men would redraw all of these and keep about 1 out of every 3 drawings for a total of 345,600. And after that, there was around 2,000 miscellaneous sketches, which means in an 80-minute animated feature film, the total amount of drawings is 2,519,200 drawings. Since the animators only had experience in the rubber hose style of animation used in Silly Symphonies, Walt had his artists attend life drawing classes to develop realistic adult human movement. Some of the Silly Symphonies made during the production of Snow White were also used as a testing ground for this more realistic style of movement. One of the most well-known being The Goddess of Spring, an adaptation of the myth of Hades and Persephone, complete with a jellybone moonwalk. Ham Lusk, the supervising animator for Snow White's character, even proposed a more cartoony design that would be easier to animate at one point. This beta version of Snow White's design and model more heavily resembling the characters from the Silly Symphonies, complete with rubber hose-shaped arms and legs for easier animation since animating realistic adult human movement was still a hurdle the studio was trying to get over. Grim Natwick, the creator of Betty Boop, was also hired to lead animation on Our Princess and animated over 120 scenes with 6 assistants working under him. So if you've ever wondered why Snow White seems to have some boopisms, that's because of Grim Natwick. I should note that there was a pretty one-sided feud between Ham Lusk and Grim Natwick's units. Lusk was promised supervision over Snow White and saw Grim's addition as an intrusion on his turf. No, I'm not kidding. It was really that petty. Some people, I swear to God. Grim, for the most part, paid no mind to it since he was busy animating that crazy amount of scenes I mentioned before. Now, something to keep in mind is that Walt made his animators work idiotic hours on par with the crunch horror stories we hear about within large video game studios of today. This included having deferred pay with the promise of major bonuses if the film was a financial success. Aren't you just glad nothing has changed for artists in roughly a century? So, when the film was a massive success, Grim expected to be paid for the enormous amount of work and overtime he did, as he should, only to find scenes he did that were credited as Lusk's work. After seeing this, Grim left Disney understandably in disgust following the production of Snow White. At the very least, Grim's influence remained in his assistants who worked under him during the production of Snow White. Mark Davis, who later became one of Disney's 9 old men, was described by Grim as like having a second right hand to work with. Much of his responsibilities involved tweaking the proportions of Grim's Snow White to better match that of Lusk's as Walt wanted. Mark would later go on to lead the animation on iconic Disney women like Cinderella, Aurora, and Maleficent. During production, Jack Campbell also started showing promise as an animator and moved over to Grim Natwick's East Coast unit to act as an assistant to him. This led to there being 3 different Snow Whites appearing in the finished film. Lusk's Snow has very doll-like features, with her model conforming more to the design of the Silly Symphonies heroines. This was what Walt considered the ideal look for Snow White and wanted both Jack and Grim to ensure their animations conform to this style. The way I tend to pick her out on rewatches is that Lusk's version has the most noticeably rounded eyes, though in my honest opinion she's also the Snow White most prone to looking off model.
Come on, prick up. Won't you smile for me?
Now Campbell's Snow features the heaviest use of rotoscoping, which makes for a good middle ground between these three styles. And I know some nerds watching are going to try and insinuate that means Campbell is a bad animator, when that is very much not how rotoscope is used. For one, rotoscope is meant to give animators a reference for more realistic movement. You shouldn't just trace over it or else the animation will look stilted. There's actually a term for this amongst animators even without rotoscoping when they say your animation is too referenced. In fact, without making some stylistic choices such as exaggerating the poses or the expressions, you end up with abominations like what AI generates. And I think the way Campbell used rotoscoping to the best effect is exemplified in his work on the Blue Fairy and Pinocchio. Here, the much more referenced and realistic movement helps to make her seem more ethereal and otherworldly in a way only a skilled animator can convey. Compared to the other two animators, Grim Natwick's princess shows off his clear experience with animating women, with her feeling the most alive of the three, bolstered by the fact he was the best draftsman as well. Like I said before, the points where Snow White's boopisms are the most obvious are definitely shots that were done by Natwick, along with any moments where she has subtle yet kind of sultry expressions. According to Mark Davis, who assisted Natwick, he wanted Snow White to possess more than a simple cuteness and instead have a vitality to her. Like I mentioned earlier with Snow White, the Evil Queen also went through quite a design transformation throughout pre-production. Early on, the Queen was drawn to be fat and frumpy in a style that was more befitting of the Silly Symphonies, and the Evil Queen from Fleischer's own Betty Boop short was studied by Disney's animators. This trajectory took a sharp turn, however, when Albert Herder, a sketch artist for Disney, chose to make a design that was far more realistic in style, which led to the studio deciding that the Queen should be beautiful, regal, cold, and sinister, so she could be a much scarier character on screen. And honestly, thank God they chose this direction so we could see this shamelessly vile and threatening villain steal the show and snatch wigs whenever she's on screen.
Cover girl, put the bass in your walk, head to toe, let your whole body talk. And what?
Step on my throat, mother.
Now, while Snow White was already a hefty challenge to animate, even Disney legend Andreas Deja, who supervised the animation on the iconic villains Gaston, Jafar, and Scar, thinks the Evil Queen was one of the toughest assignments on the film. Which makes sense when you compare the Queen's animation to the style used in the Silly Symphonies, because it becomes clear that she acts as an antithesis to that form of animation. Rather than being whimsical, cartoony, loose, and over the top to enable comedic gags, the Queen's movements are far more subtle, restrained, realistic, and geared towards being scary and threatening. And as someone who feels most at home animating female characters, I could spend hours scrubbing through the Queen's animation to analyze it. Unlike Snow White, who had 2 lead animators and 1 major assistant, the Queen's animation was led solely by Art Babbitt, who in a bit of irony had previously created Goofy. What really set Art apart was that he would intellectually analyze the characters he was assigned to animate and outline their personalities and reactions to certain situations. In modern animation, this is basically de rigueur, which is because it helps both beginner and veteran animators fully immerse themselves in the character and better push the animation for various expressions to reflect that character's inner world. Because no matter how you look at it, animators are also actors. However, in the 1920s and 30s, animation was basically regulated to shorts with a format more in line with sketch comedy, so this type of deep analysis wasn't necessary.
This was 1929, and I think the first sound pictures had just come out, so I wanted to be a part of that. And Paul's idea of making a picture was to take gag A and gag B and gag C, depending on how successful these gags had been, and putting them all together and mixing them up and shaking them in a hat and putting them all on a long pan, and then that was a picture. And the idea was not to make it good, but make it fast.
It's really easy to take for granted, but once you start looking for it, you can appreciate animation on another level. Art's perspective on Goofy as a character really helps highlight the thought and intentionality behind his acting choices here.
Now, Goofy, he was an oaf. He was someone who never knew how stupid he really was. And he thought long and carefully before he did anything, and then he did it wrong.
Now, outside of the great strides in animation, Snow White was also the first movie to make use of the multiplane camera. Prior to Snow White, backgrounds in animated shorts were on a single two-dimensional image, which created logistical problems for production because they couldn't create convincing tracking shots that maintained perspective. By splitting up the background into multiple layers, the production team could individually adjust each layer to maintain the desired perspective for each frame they shot. Also keep in mind that they would have to make small adjustments like moving the character and background layers in little bits before taking a complete picture of the entire frame. Like I said earlier, the average film runs at 24 frames per second, but for those not acquainted with this idea, it means 24 of these pictures, each with little adjustments, will flash before your eyes in the span of 1 second to create the illusion of movement. Once you apply the math that there's 60 seconds in a minute and that Snow White is an 83-minute long film, hopefully it'll set in just how much work went into shooting the final painted drawings for it. It really can't be understated how much of a technical breakthrough the multiplane camera was for animation as a whole. On a more simplistic level, it created the illusion of characters occupying a physical three-dimensional space, like here where Snow White moves away from the camera to explore upstairs in the dwarf's cottage. The multiplane camera was also key in allowing the animators to do visually striking shots like when the queen transforms into an ugly hag. The camera would continue to be used in following Disney features such as Pinocchio and Fantasia, with Bambi being notable for having some truly striking shots utilizing it. However, by the late 1980s, technology had marched on, and after The Little Mermaid, the multiplane camera was retired for a digital equivalent that saw use starting with The Rescuers Down Under. Through all the blood, sweat, tears, and money, Snow White met its winter deadline of December 21st, 1937 and premiered at Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles. The response was nothing short of euphoric. Its initial worldwide gross at the box office was $8.5 million, which when adjusted for inflation equals $181 million in 2023, which made it the highest grossing sound film of all time until Gone with the Wind premiered. The film would go on to be nominated at the Academy Awards for Best Musical Score in 1938, only to lose out to a movie I've never even heard of until researching this. At the 1939 Academy Awards, however, popular child star Shirley Temple presented Walt Disney his honorary award, which included one normal-sized Oscar along with 7 miniature ones. In fact, this film was so beloved on release that even one of history's greatest monsters, Adolf Hitler, drew fan art of the dwarves. And from there, the film has gone on to be one of the 10 most influential films in the entire history of cinema, blasting open the door to prove that animation could very well compete with live-action film. But by all means, Disney, it's just an 85-year-old cartoon. Outside of the film's impact and legacy though, I also want to take some time to actually defend Snow White as a character. I'm not going to claim she's the most nuanced character ever, just that she's not a blight upon feminism like she's made out to be. Yes, in parts of the story she can be rather passive, but at the same time she does use what skills she has to be proactive where she can. So while Rachel Zegler's opinion of the character annoys me, it isn't surprising to hear from a 22-year-old who wouldn't be expected to have a holistic view of feminism yet. If anything, most of the flack she's been getting is more because particularly in America, we hate women, especially women of color who have individual opinions, which makes Rachel an ideal mouthpiece for the Disney company's decade-long practice of doing mediocre remakes of beloved classics while basically spitting on Walt's grave for profitability.
Am I really gonna defile this grave for money? Of course I am! Jackpot!
I'm not gonna pretend Rachel's interview comments haven't made her look smug in spots, but again, not many 22-year-olds are particularly eloquent. It just reads more that her personal dislike of the film is being exploited by the Disney company in order to get free advertisement from outrage culture. The fact that she just happens to be a woman of color with her own opinions makes her perfect as a lightning rod and scapegoat to the Disney company for their own failings. Yes, Rachel Zegler is heavily featured in the marketing, but just like the disaster with Game of Thrones, she ultimately has little creative control over this film. If we're going to rake anyone over the coals for creative decisions, it should be the executives at Disney who always have the last say. Now, another reason some claim Snow White is regressive is because her unbridled sincerity tends to rub teenagers and 20-somethings the wrong way as they come to grips with their own identities. Especially with how deeply irony-poisoned we are today, the film must seem unbearably saccharine to some. However, a lot of the criticism towards Snow White has to do with her traditionally feminine traits like compassion, optimism, and domestic skill, all things we tend to view with cynicism and derision in our patriarchal society.
Women!
And in an age where we see female characters adventuring and self-actualizing about their identity and place in the world, I imagine Snow White comes off as mind-numbingly static to some. Though because Snow White's story is very much about survival and not losing hope when things are at their worst, I actually think it's critical that she doesn't change. Really, it's much more about the positive change she brings about in others. This starts with the huntsman, who is unable to kill her on the queen's orders after Snow's very clear display of compassion to something smaller and weaker than she is. Instead of actual weapons, Snow White utilizes her kindness as both a sword and shield, letting her bypass others' emotional defenses and compel them to assist and protect her. But the OG Disney princess is more than just kind. We have to remember that she's basically a perfectly engineered champion to help lead the masses through the Great Depression, a truly miserable time for the world. What Snow White lacks in physical prowess, she makes up for in a godlike fortitude that allows her to endure through the horrors she faces. Literally 11.5 minutes in and she's just run through the forest afraid for her life, starts crying, then she sits up and says this.
And all because I was afraid. I'm so ashamed of the fuss I've made.
She then immediately befriends the animals and sings a song that shows how tough she really is, all while never shedding another tear throughout the rest of the movie. I know some people watching will probably think they're too mature to learn a meaningful lesson from a Disney princess movie of all things, but I think her point here actually makes a great case for giving yourself agency in a situation that's actively trying to strip it from you. Snow White's little song here is literally about being able to pick herself back up again and keep pressing forward to find new happiness. Hell, as I said at the beginning, I've been laid off for over a month now and find Snow White's form of hope and optimism to make things better for herself kind of inspirational. No, I don't care if people think that's sappy, because you can't pretend that she doesn't have a tremendous amount of inner strength that we often don't give anyone remotely feminine credit for. Obviously, it doesn't mean be mindlessly happy, but how we, just like Snow White, can use an informed sense of optimism to make the best of hard times. Sure, she isn't actually defeating the queen, but she also isn't letting the queen affect her on a psychological level that could ruin her life, which is incredibly inspirational in an age where there are more concerted efforts to give visibility and support to abuse victims. Snow White's usage of optimism and childlike joy as a tool to cope with the horrors the story throws at her makes her quite resilient even compared to modern heroines. I've never heard of any 14-year-old being so emotionally well adjusted to becoming homeless after escaping an abusive parent. I know some people will try and jump on how Snow White being kind to the queen while disguised makes her stupid, and to that I say, her actions make sense in the narrative. For the last 69 minutes, yes, the queen and Snow White meet again at that time, I checked, we've firmly established at this point that Snow White is innately trusting. It's literally why there's a cut earlier from the queen's murder command straight to the glade where Snow White is picking flowers in. They don't need to say she's trusting when the film is clearly showing us she is, since it's kind of a visual medium, show don't tell. Either way, another very clear trait is that Snow White knows that you don't get anything for free, which is why after committing possibly one of the most polite cases of breaking and entering, she decides to clean up the house with her animal friends. This isn't because it's her feminine duty, but because she's literally homeless and is willing to work for a roof over her head.
I know. We'll clean the house and surprise them. Then maybe they'll let me stay.
This leads into my next point that many people rather lazily attack about Snow White, and that she is the most domestic princess. While they focus so much on how it reinforces traditional gender roles, they also forget that Snow White's domestic affinity isn't something she has to fulfill her quote, womanly duties. The first page of the storybook in the opening even says the queen forced her to work as a scullery maid, which gives her a skill set that she peddles to the dwarves in order to stay with them.
And if you let me stay, I'll keep house for you. I'll wash and sew and sweep and cook and...
And this is very resonant with the attitude from the era of the Great Depression when the film premiered, and arguably just as much in recent times given our current widespread economic hardship. Instead of getting our panties in a knot over Snow White having a traditionally feminine skill set, why aren't we celebrating how resourceful she is for using what skills she does have to try and carve out a better life than her current situation? This is about 39 minutes into the movie, and so far, our princess protagonist has displayed many skills that we take for granted. She has great emotional intelligence that we first see when she's helping the baby bird reunite with its family. Her capacity for sincere kindness allows her to easily connect with people and animals so they want to help her, which is literally a form of networking. Upon entering the cottage, she shows both resourcefulness and innate leadership skills befitting a young monarch by combining her domestic skill with delegating the animals. Even before cleaning the cottage, she recognizes that there's an unfilled niche in the dwarves' lives that she can easily fill. And immediately after ingratiating herself with the dwarves, Snow takes on a firm but fair maternal role in their lives that further displays her ability to lead. We see Snow White can juggle all of the responsibilities of basically being a single parent of 7 man-children while still maintaining a skip in her step. Having talked to a couple single parents in the past who feel exhausted and overwhelmed with the responsibilities of just taking care of 1 to 2 kids, Snow White looks like a domestic superhero. Sure, Snow White does have a traditionally feminine personality, but she's also intelligent and resourceful, which combined with her steely core allows her to persevere in spite of the darkness. Additionally, Snow White is already self-actualized as a character and knows what she wants. While many people disparage her for having romantic dreams about being swept off her feet by a prince, I honestly have to ask, is that really a bad thing? I'm not saying all women's stories should involve getting a man, but at the same time, there's nothing wrong with a protagonist wanting a healthy, loving romance in their story. It's a fundamental human desire, and I think a story about a literal abuse survivor escaping their abuser and finding someone who truly loves them makes for a genuinely touching tale. No matter how much people want to smugly snark at Snow White, it's fundamentally about an abuse victim escaping their guardian for their own safety and well-being. Said abuse victim then gains a found family that wants to protect her from the abusive guardian's attempts to reach her. I'm betting none of you are expecting to hear that read of a classic fairy tale. By all means, take a queer lens to that interpretation, because it's intentional on my part and I encourage it.
I'm gay.
It's also why the she's passive and therefore bad take really irks me, because all it does is encourage victim blaming while also denigrating stories about people who are just trying to survive a bad situation. Throughout much of history, women had no control of their own destinies, so they had to make do with what they had. And this hyper-focus on stories where characters must push their gender forward has an ugly implication that if you aren't in a position to do this, your story shouldn't be told. So the bottom line is that yes, Snow White is very domestic and feminine, but as I stated earlier, she does show her own form of agency and even leadership within that role. If a woman wants to be domestic like Snow White, we shouldn't be shaming her for that. What isn't acceptable is expecting all women to conform to this type of role. We should be doing this for men too, since they suffer just as much under all of these patriarchal and systemic constraints. So Snow White is fine, guys. She makes it clear that her traditionally feminine traits are a strength, not a weakness in her own story. The first thing we need to establish is that Snow White's prince, along with Cinderella's, are not really characters. Both are quite literally sexy lamp rewards that the ladies earn for enduring the trials of their respective stories. Which is why I find calling the prince a creep in Snow White a weird take, because he isn't a player with any agency in this story. One might say that he's a purse with legs in terms of his actual relation to Snow White, the Ken to her Barbie, if you will. He appears in the first 5 minutes of the film, then the prince doesn't even cross Snow White's mind again until the 56-minute mark, and because I'm enough of a nerd to count it, his total presence in the story, including both screen time and mentions by other characters, is only about 8 minutes in an 83-minute film. This means his presence is only around for roughly 9% of the actual movie and barely a blip on Snow White's radar, which really shows how shallow and dishonest the take of Snow White waiting around and pining for the prince is too. I'm wishing and someday my prince will come are only a little over 5 minutes together when added to the prince's 8 minutes. So then what the hell is Snow White doing for the roughly hour and 8 minutes that clearly don't involve the prince? Hopefully I've made my point about how lazy, dishonest, and frankly stupid this claim is.
Fools! Idiots! Imbeciles!
The fact that the prince functionally ceases to exist when he's not on screen really highlights that he's not a player in this story. Snow White does sing about wishing for the one she loves to find her, but I don't get how this is reductive compared to any other teenager having romantic dreams. Like I also said earlier, Snow White is an abuse survivor, and she describes her wish to the well as such.
And I'm dreaming of the nice things you said.
Sure, it seems kind of shallow, but Snow White just wants someone who will treat her well. Which again begs the point, what the hell is wrong with wanting that? As someone who survived an abusive father myself, I most definitely fantasized about being in a healthy, sweeping romance with someone even years after he left for a Ukrainian mail-order bride. And in a way, I got my wish just like Snow White did, given how I now have an incredibly devoted boyfriend who gives me the kind of love I've fantasized about. Did I mention I have a boyfriend, by the way? Because I was sure I mentioned him.
First of all, Jonathan, you are very handsome. Not as handsome as my husband, Harry Hamlin. Harry Hamlin, I love you, baby.
Yeah, from LA.
Harry Hamlin. Harry Hamlin. Have you met my husband? Say it one more time. Harry Hamlin. Don't talk about my husband. Harry Hamlin. I love Harry Hamlin.
Yes.
I get that plenty of women don't want to feel confined into only being like Snow White, which I agree with. But acting like a desire for romance is worthy of being denigrated only comes off as misogynistic and even affects men who have more traditionally feminine personalities and romantic goals like the OG Disney princess. And either way, the men she actually spends the lion's share of the movie interacting with are her found family amongst the 7 dwarves. Unlike the prince, who could literally be a figment of the princess's imagination, the dwarves are the men that Snow White actually develops a meaningful found family bond with. And part of what helped this film age well is that while the dwarves all have personalities based on a specific trait, they still all have individuality. Unlike in modern films where members of a group like this would function more like a hive mind, each dwarf has a distinct personality and relationship with Snow White, which is best shown during the silly song. Yes, the silly song can easily feel like filler, which is a criticism the film is very much guilty of at points, but I think this moment isn't one of them. This scene clearly shows us how tender the dwarves' affection for Snow White is, and each of their acting choices reflects the 7 relationships that have been developed in such a short time. In a modern film, we'd get painfully direct scenes with Snow White and each dwarf to show their relationships instead of organically meshing them together like the silly song. And such scenes are the antithesis of animation, at least with how I learned it from my mentors. To quote my copy of The Illusion of Life, nothing is more deadly in animation than explanations of who the characters are and what they are doing there, followed by more discussion of what they're going to do about it. The reason for this is because animation is an intensely visual medium that uses varying degrees of stylized movement and acting choices to tell a story, with the point being that just having your characters exposit in an animated film will more often than not fail to use the medium to its full potential. That isn't to say you can't have very dynamic scenes where something is being explained, but it's a very fine line to walk. We see this efficient and entertaining form of subtle storytelling in what seems like a nonsensical filler song in Snow White, which makes it even more important for later on when Snow White finally chomps on the roofie apple and the dwarves all mourn her loss, which floored audiences when the film premiered. It's not the deepest development, but it goes back to my point from much earlier about how the story is more about how Snow White brings about change for the better in others.
She sang us pretty songs and made us smile. At bedtime, she told wonderful stories
about falling in love with the prince she'd met.
And when we went to work, she gave us all a kiss.
She was so full of kindness. Why, she made better folk of all of us.
This is most readily apparent in how her relationship with Grumpy develops over the course of the film. When the dwarves first encounter the princess in hiding, Grumpy makes it very clear that he thinks Snow White is both unwelcome and that he doesn't trust women. A bit of subtle comedy here is how Grumpy doesn't trust women and femininity, despite not fully understanding what it entirely is.
What are wicked wiles? I don't know, but I'm agin 'em.
This resistance to Snow White's natural charm and kindness also gives the film's B story meaningful conflict, no matter how small it feels. It also gives our titular princess some insecurity to help round out her character when she mentions this little bit during her bedtime prayer.
Oh, yes. And please make Grumpy like me.
Considering Grumpy wanted to throw her out when she had nowhere else to go, you really can't blame the girl for wanting this. And as we see later on, Snow White's sincere kindness does erode away at Grumpy's curmudgeonly attitude, most obviously after he receives a kiss goodbye from her. This character growth fully culminates after Sleepy posits that maybe the queen got to Snow White while the animals tried to warn them. It's Grumpy who's the first to say anything to this news and lead the charge home. If anything, Grumpy's arc shows how traditionally feminine traits like kindness and compassion are healthy to experience and open you up to feel a wider range of emotions. Despite hiding his face at the funeral, Grumpy openly weeps at the loss of Snow White. He then dances with joy later on when she's revived by the prince at the end. Both of these things being the sort of openly emotional mush that he would refuse to engage in earlier in the film. Hopefully by now I've peeled off some of the layers of logic armor that many wear as a mask of cynical worldliness so we can see the good in this old Disney film. It's by no means a perfect film, given some of the humor is pretty corny and the hand-washing scene is just filler for gags, but it has aged better than the criticisms against it. Valid criticisms do exist in regards to Disney princess films, but the ones created by the lazy pop feminism of the 2000s are absolutely not it. If anything, much like the problems inherent to the girl boss trope, the lazy pop feminism takes are much more dishonest and revealingly misogynistic when you apply more than surface level thought to them. Instead of giving in to CinemaSins brain rot, maybe we could try focusing even more on what makes the film still great. Even if you don't care for the movie, we can still appreciate how much of a technical marvel it was for being made in 1937, with its heartbreakingly gorgeous backgrounds that were all hand-painted and the huge leaps made in animation proficiency. Outside of a few slightly off-model frames that are great for memes, nearly every frame of this movie could be hung up as a painting in your own home. Better yet, let's admire and appreciate how this film wears its horror influences on its sleeve. It's rather metal compared to how sanitized modern Disney movies are. The fact there are still people who say this film scared them as a child, I'd argue makes it vastly more memorable than the majority of modern animated films, which are more safe and conventional. Considering how hungry audiences are for a legitimate old-school Disney villain, just watch the film and enjoy the OG. Personally, I can't get enough of her serving Lady Macbeth realness and how shamelessly vile she is about trying to kill a 14-year-old.
Gust of wind to fan my
In a world where major studios and Disney itself have aggressively sanded off the edges of their films, it becomes easier to appreciate Snow White for how radically different it is from modern Disney. The way the film isn't afraid to use genuinely creepy imagery despite being animated makes it feel quite fresh compared to many modern films. Of course, some parents take issue with this, but I personally resonate with veteran animator Don Bluth here.
If you don't show the darkness, you don't appreciate the light. If it weren't for December, no one would appreciate May. It's just important that you see both sides of that. And as far as a happy ending, I believe the happy ending is important if you really want to have mothers have their children go see it, and if they themselves will go. But there's more to it than that. I think more importantly is that when you walk out of the theater, there's something that you have that you get to take home. What did it teach me? Am I a better person for having watched it?
Snow White is by no means my favorite Disney movie, but I respect its impact and legacy along with how well it has aged visually over 80 years later. It's definitely something I watch more as the movie equivalent of comfort food, but that doesn't mean I can't derive further value from it. If you are going through a hard time like I am with being laid off, maybe consider giving this old film a rewatch. At least for me, there's something comforting in a film about a young woman being put through such darkness but still being able to retain a sense of hope that things will get better. It's also genuinely refreshing to see how readily her kindness is both accepted and reciprocated by both the animals and the dwarves. The film is really a testament to how your sense of optimism can be an active choice in defiance of people and circumstances that seek to tear you down. I should also make it clear that I really don't care if Snow White is portrayed as POC. I think it is one of the dumbest things to get worked up about in my opinion. And if you wanted to justify the name for a POC portrayal, just reference the mock orange flower called a Snow White. Then the name is just like hundreds of girls' names that come from flowers. Problem solved. At the end of the day, it's a freaking fairy tale. You really want to lose your mind over this? There is plenty of merit to updating Snow White and other classic fairy tales to appeal to modern tastes, but corporate wokeness and girl boss feminism are things that shouldn't be introduced. If anything, they only serve to devalue any of the themes that are timeless in these old stories. How about instead we use the framing I mentioned earlier with Snow White being emphasized as an abuse survivor? Then it could be a touching tale of how her found family helps heal the trauma with genuine love and support. The OG Disney film flirts with this, but it'd be interesting to see that take fully explored since it would resonate a lot with LGBT people and anyone else who has endured or escaped abuse. Unfortunately, that idea is far too transgressive and risky for Disney, so they'll never touch it. Their entire brand now revolves around cynical corporate values rather than anything emotionally or artistically inspired. And this may lead to their greater downfall as they fail to realize why the film originally known as Disney's Folly still endures as the fairest version of them all.
Perhaps that will please her. Huntsman, what are you doing?
I cannot do it.
I'm Snow White.
True, you are a bit pale, dearie, but what's your name?
May I take her with me?
What? No, never!